the Galactic Empire stood as a monument to unbroken dominance. For millennia it had expanded across stars, bending countless civilizations beneath its banners, each conquest reinforcing the illusion of eternity. Its admirals and governors regarded resistance as a fleeting inconvenience, for no species had ever risen from obscurity to challenge its rule. Vast archives chronicled victory after victory, entire cultures erased or assimilated without consequence. In this unshakable certainty, humanity was catalogued as insignificant, an obscure species confined to a backwater world circling a mediocre star. The Empire's envoys delivered ultimatums to Earth as they had to so many others: unconditional surrender, tribute without end, and obedience enforced by fleets of war. The message was cold and absolute, declaring that defiance would be crushed, promising annihilation should humanity resist. To the Empire, such proclamations were mere formality, repeated scripts from a history of submission. The expectation was compliance without hesitation. Within the halls of command, analysts dismissed humanity as primitive, their signals judged unsophisticated, their fleets assumed to be little more than local patrol craft. Imperial surveys noted Earth's reliance on industrial might rather than refined technologies, and this became the foundation of arrogance. To those who ruled the stars, humanity seemed incapable of matching the precision or elegance of imperial engineering. The assumption was that resistance, if any, would be brief, a show of feudal pride soon extinguished. Even when scout fleets returned fragmented data, strange sensor anomalies, interference that disrupted long-range scans, reports of disciplined planetary defenses, the High Command discarded them as exaggerations or mechanical failures. Generals scoffed at the notion of hidden strength, their worldview unable to reconcile a young species standing equal to their legions. They were blinded by tradition, bound to a belief that no one could rise from the margins of the galaxy to threaten their supremacy. What they did not perceive was a calculated silence. For decades humanity had observed from the shadows, studying the patterns of empire, watching the predictable rhythms of conquest. Industrial expansions cloaked themselves as routine growth, but every facility was sharpened for war production. Colonies hidden beyond mapped routes constructed fleets in secrecy, while Earth's industries transformed into engines of armament. Probes sent by the Empire vanished in carefully orchestrated traps, their losses explained away by commanders who refused to see danger. Each disappearance was deliberate, each broken signal a warning unrecognized. Humanity's unity, forged in the shadow of an impending storm, went unnoticed by a power too accustomed to submission. Where other species fractured under pressure, Earth consolidated, directing every resource, every mind, every hand toward the inevitable confrontation. The Empire's arrogance gave humanity the time it needed, and time became the sharpest weapon. The first signs of miscalculation emerged at the frontier. An Imperial vanguard entered the outer reaches of human space expecting a swift display of dominance. Their sensors fell into darkness as fields of interference blanketed entire sectors. Communications collapsed, formations drifted blind, and without warning, ships began to vanish from their tactical displays. Panic whispered across the fleet, but discipline kept them moving forward, unaware that every maneuver was already anticipated. The last transmissions captured only fragments, blinding flashes across hulls, a silence following eruptions of energy, and the unmistakable tone of shock as officers realized their weapons found no targets. Then there was nothing but static. The Empire treated it as an anomaly, another unfortunate error in an otherwise inevitable campaign. Yet buried within command channels was an unease unspoken, a shadow of recognition that something different had occurred. A single fleet should not have been erased without a trace. No primitive world should have struck with such precision. In the heart of the Empire, where confidence had reigned unbroken for generations, a quiet question began to form, though no one dared voice it aloud. What if humanity was not what they believed? When the veil finally lifted, the revelation was devastating. The Empire had anticipated scattered resistance, a handful of outdated vessels, perhaps a desperate planetary shield soon to be overwhelmed. Instead, an armada rose from the depths of silence, assembled not by chance but by design, fleets hidden beyond the reach of Imperial surveillance now converging in disciplined formation. humanity revealed itself not as prey but as predator, patient and deliberate, with the weight of entire worlds forged into steel and fire. The first encounter was not a clash of equals but a calculated demonstration. Imperial squadrons advanced in confidence, their ships gleaming with centuries of tradition, engines humming with the certainty of superiority. Yet as they entered contested space, they found themselves surrounded by machines they had never catalogued. Human ships were brutal, angular, stripped of ornament, and built solely for war. Every line of their construction spoke of efficiency and intent, each vessel designed for speed, endurance, and overwhelming lethality. Where imperial fleets favored spectacle, humans favored destruction. In an instant, entire formations disappeared under a storm of concentrated fire. Missiles and kinetic projectiles moved with terrifying coordination, saturating defenses faster than automated systems could compensate. Energy pulses followed in relentless waves, bypassing shields and tearing through hulls with precision that suggested not improvisation but years of refinement. The Empire's ships, once symbols of invincibility, became wreckage drifting through void, their deaths marked not by cries of resistance but by stunned silence. The shock was not confined to physical losses. For every destroyed vessel, a deeper wound opened in the Empire's confidence. Their officers, trained to expect disarray from newly contacted civilizations, encountered an enemy whose discipline rivaled their own. Human fleets maneuvered with ruthless cohesion, reacting instantly to changes, turning ambushes into opportunities, exploiting every hesitation. Where Imperial captains awaited orders from Central Command, human formations shifted with fluid autonomy, adapting to battle conditions in ways no doctrine of the Empire allowed. Observers who survived these first engagements reported the same chilling realization: humanity had studied them. Every tactic, every formation, every reliance on hierarchy had been anticipated and countered. Ambushes struck precisely at weak points long thought secure, supply ships destroyed before reinforcements could even organize, communication nodes jammed at the exact moment coordination was required. It was not desperation driving humanity but preparation. Every move revealed years of analysis hidden behind feigned insignificance. The Empire had always wielded terror as a weapon, broadcasting inevitability until opponents broke before the first shot. Humanity inverted this strategy. They spoke little, sending no long declarations, no attempts at negotiation. Their silence was heavier than any threat, for it was accompanied only by the unbroken advance of fleets. In that quiet absence of explanation, Imperial commanders faced a new kind of fear, an adversary who did not seek compromise, who did not even acknowledge the hierarchy of conquest, who fought not to resist but to erase. The psychological fracture spread faster than the physical losses. Subjugated worlds that had long endured imperial authority began whispering of change. News of shattered armadas moved across trade lanes, carried by fugitives and broken warships limping home. Each story magnified the sense that something unthinkable had arrived, that the Empire had finally encountered an opponent immune to intimidation. Even in the core, where authority had remained unquestioned for centuries, unease grew. Questions circulated in hushed tones. How had a minor species constructed fleets of such magnitude undetected? How had their weapons pierced defenses engineered over millennia? How had they turned the very doctrine of conquest against its creators? Answers never came, only more reports of destruction. The Empire had believed humanity incapable of standing against them. Now they saw the truth. Humanity had never intended to stand against them. Humanity had prepared to strike through them. The reports reached the Imperial core like fractures spreading through glass, each message another crack in the illusion of permanence. Fleets that had once carried the pride of countless victories returned in fragments, or did not return at all. Debriefings from survivors were scattered, broken accounts of overwhelming force and precision strikes that defied belief. Commanders who had once spoken with certainty now stammered through reports, unable to reconcile their doctrine with the defeats they had witnessed. Within the Throneworld's chambers, confidence gave way to silence. Generations of propaganda had forged the belief that no species could resist the Empire's dominion, that its fleets were eternal guardians of order. But here was evidence carved into wreckage and loss, a truth that could not be smothered. The mythology of invincibility was unraveling. Where once citizens cheered the march of their legions, whispers now spread through marketplaces and corridors, questions rising in shadows. If humans could defy the Empire, then perhaps the Empire was not unshakable at all. The leadership tried to counter the tide with proclamations of stability, promising that reinforcements would soon crush the upstarts. Yet each reassurance was undercut by fresh defeats. Whole sectors reported severed supply chains, entire squadrons erased before relief could arrive. The faster the Empire tried to cover the spreading cracks, the more visible they became. The image of eternal control faltered not just in the minds of subjects, but in the hearts of the rulers themselves. Rival factions within the hierarchy sensed weakness. For centuries they had accepted the central power as absolute, but doubt reshaped ambition. Some whispered that if a species from the margins could defy imperial authority, then perhaps the throne itself was vulnerable. Others argued for appeasement, claiming humanity might be negotiated with, though such thoughts bordered on treason. In the secrecy of strategy halls, arguments turned heated, as unity dissolved into suspicion. Psychological warfare deepened the collapse. Human fleets, ruthless in battle, sometimes spared individual vessels only to release them adrift, crippled but functional enough to return home. These ships carried tales of terror greater than any broadcast could achieve, stories of weapons that pierced shields as if they were illusions, of ambushes so precise they felt orchestrated by omniscient minds, of soldiers who fought without hesitation until the last fragment of hull fell silent. Survivors spread fear not because they were commanded to, but because they could not contain it. Across conquered worlds, long-subdued populations heard the stories and began to dream. Rebellion, once unthinkable, gained shape in whispers exchanged in underground chambers. If Earth could resist, why not others? The certainty of imperial permanence had been the greatest tool of suppression, but certainty was dissolving into doubt. The chain of obedience that spanned galaxies weakened link by link, shaken by the realization that the impossible had occurred. Imperial strategists tried to calculate the threat in terms they understood: fleets, resources, firepower. Yet the more they analyzed, the more the numbers betrayed them. Humanity did not simply defend, it attacked with intent to dismantle. Every strike severed arteries of communication, every assault cut deeper into the system that held the Empire together. The war was not about territory, it was about collapse. The realization spread among those who studied the battlefield: humanity was not fighting for survival, but for annihilation of imperial control itself. For the first time in generations, fear took root in the ruling council. The Empire had survived rebellions, uprisings, even plagues, but never had it faced an enemy that sought not to challenge its reign but to erase it completely. The prospect was unthinkable, yet the evidence lay scattered across ruined sectors. No matter how the leadership tried to frame the conflict as temporary, a hidden truth pressed closer with each defeat. Humanity had become something they had never encountered, a species that did not bend, did not break, and would not stop. The myth of eternal dominance was gone, and in its place stood a reality that chilled every chamber of power: the Empire was vulnerable. Human fleets moved with relentless precision, advancing not as explorers but as executioners dismantling the foundation of an empire. Strikes landed not at random but with exact calculation, severing the arteries that fed the imperial war machine. Supply convoys vanished into silent voids, shipyards that had stood for centuries collapsed into fire, and communication relays fell one after another until entire sectors were blind and deaf. What the Empire had once called unbreakable lines of control unraveled into scattered fragments, each unable to reach the other. Where the Empire had built grandeur, humanity brought ruin. Fortress worlds that had stood as monuments to intimidation were bypassed and left isolated, their defenses irrelevant once the routes surrounding them were cut. Orbital bastions designed to hold off fleets for months were reduced to wreckage within hours, not by sheer numbers but by precision. Every strike was deliberate, every maneuver intended to collapse infrastructure rather than occupy space. Humanity waged war like a surgeon wielding a blade, removing pieces until the body could no longer function. On worlds that had long lived under imperial chains, the sudden collapse of authority was like the breaking of a dam. Populations that had known nothing but obedience awoke to silence from their rulers. Garrisons found themselves cut off from reinforcements, their fleets destroyed, their supply lines severed. In some places, rebellion flared instantly, civilians taking up arms against their weakened overseers. In others, quiet revolutions began, as communities refused to send tribute, refusing for the first time in generations to kneel. Humanity's advance created not just destruction but opportunity, and across the galaxy, suppressed voices began to rise. The Empire struggled to contain the spreading chaos, but its size became its greatest weakness. With borders spanning countless systems, no single fleet could cover the fractures appearing everywhere at once. Every time ships were dispatched to reinforce one front, humanity struck at another. When garrisons regrouped to defend core sectors, outer regions slipped further from control. The vastness that had once inspired awe now became a liability, a network too sprawling to defend and too rigid to adapt. What unsettled Imperial strategists most was the deliberate nature of humanity's campaign. These were not reckless raids nor desperate attempts at survival. They were systematic attacks designed to dismantle the mechanisms of rule. Trade collapsed, morale disintegrated, and fear spread faster than any fleet. Each strike sent ripples across the Empire, amplifying panic far beyond the immediate battlefield. The narrative of eternal dominance was shredded, replaced by the image of an enemy that moved like an unstoppable tide. Captured transmissions told of the same pattern everywhere: human fleets appearing without warning, striking with overwhelming force, and vanishing before organized resistance could arrive. No words were offered, no demands for tribute, no proclamations of conquest. Silence followed every battle, a silence more terrifying than any threat, for it left nothing to negotiate with, and no possibility of compromise. The Empire was not facing rebellion, it was facing eradication of its foundations. Alien populations under Imperial dominion began to see humanity not as invaders but as liberators of a new order. Some rallied openly, offering intelligence and sabotage against Imperial installations. Others waited quietly, knowing that every Imperial defeat brought them closer to freedom. The Empire's command structure, already strained by internal doubt, now faced betrayal from within its own territories. Where once fear had bound entire sectors, now hope was loosening those chains. The advance did not pause, did not falter, and did not negotiate. Human fleets pressed deeper, striking simultaneously at the edges and near the core, ensuring no region felt secure. Imperial forces were forced into retreat, not in organized withdrawal but in desperate scattering, leaving behind broken stations and abandoned outposts. For the first time in living memory, the Empire was not expanding, it was shrinking. The tide of humanity moved forward with inevitability, leaving behind silence and ruins, reshaping the galaxy with every step. The Empire, once thought eternal, was collapsing under the weight of an enemy it had dismissed as irrelevant, an enemy that had proven itself unstoppable. The Empire gathered its strength for one final defense, calling upon every fleet still capable of movement, every reserve hidden in forgotten shipyards, every weapon left in its colossal arsenals. Across the core sectors, the remnants of power converged, determined to form a barrier that would halt humanity's advance. The Grand Fleet stretched across systems in numbers unmatched in centuries, banners raised to remind themselves of the glory they believed eternal. Admirals swore that discipline and sheer scale would succeed where others had failed, that the myth of invincibility could be restored through one decisive victory. Humanity answered without hesitation. Their forces did not approach cautiously, nor did they assemble in scattered groups to test defenses. They arrived in mass, pouring into contested sectors with a unity that carried the weight of purpose beyond survival. They did not mirror the rigid lines of the Empire. They surged like a storm, unpredictable and unrelenting. Where the Empire sought order, humanity brought chaos, and within that chaos, destruction followed with precision. The battle erupted across multiple star systems at once. Imperial formations advanced in grand arcs, weapons blazing, their numbers enough to darken entire skies. Yet their structure, perfected over millennia of one-sided wars, became their undoing. Human fleets cut through the rigid lines, piercing formations from angles never anticipated, collapsing vast units into confusion before overwhelming them piece by piece. Command relays fell silent, admirals found themselves blind as jamming fields spread like shadows, and what was meant to be coordination devolved into disorder. The Empire's weapons thundered, tearing into human ships, but for every vessel destroyed, more pressed forward. The difference was not just in numbers or firepower but in intent. Imperial forces fought to defend a legacy. Humanity fought with the singular determination to end it. Every loss was absorbed without hesitation, every counterstrike met with fiercer retaliation. Where Imperial captains hesitated to preserve tradition, human commanders adapted without pause, reshaping tactics mid-battle, exploiting every weakness the moment it appeared. The Grand Fleet, once the embodiment of fear across the galaxy, began to fracture. Entire wings broke formation, scattering in attempts to regroup, only to be isolated and consumed. Symbols of imperial authority that had stood for centuries burned in the void, their destruction witnessed by worlds that had never imagined the Empire could falter. Panic spread faster than any command could contain. What was declared a final stand revealed itself as the collapse of centuries of dominance. As the wreckage multiplied, humanity pressed deeper, pushing through what remained of resistance. The throne world itself, long untouched by war, became surrounded. For generations it had projected authority across the stars, its towers and fleets reminders of control. Now it stood vulnerable, encircled by the very species once dismissed as primitive. There was no ultimatum, no demand for surrender. Humanity did not negotiate. The Empire's leaders, waiting for words, received only silence, and the slow approach of fleets that had no intention of compromise. In that silence, fear spread through every corridor of power. The Empire's rulers understood at last that this was not a war of territory, but a judgment passed upon their existence. Their strength had failed, their myths had shattered, and their authority no longer reached beyond their walls. The inevitability they had wielded as a weapon for so long now belonged to humanity. When the final assault began, it unfolded with the same precision as every strike before. Defenses collapsed, command centers fell dark, and the once mighty symbols of eternal control crumbled. The Empire did not fall to rebellion or decay. It was destroyed by the very force it had underestimated. Humanity, forged in silence and sharpened by preparation, had become the executioner of empires. The galaxy entered a new silence. Worlds that had lived under imperial rule now looked outward and saw no banners above them, only the presence of fleets that did not demand allegiance. Humanity had proven its message without words. No chain is unbreakable, no throne eternal, no empire untouchable. Where others had submitted, Earth had risen, and in rising, had reshaped the stars forever.